How's everybody doing today? I'm doing good. Bit tired today. I'm sure you guys know how that goes. All right, we'll give it just a minute and then we'll get started. So just looking at that. Just while we're giving people a minute to get in here, there's no assignments due this week. I am going to send out an announcement today. I don't know if those of you that are here, those that are not here, but a bunch of people are behind on assignments, haven't done assignments. This is, especially with no assignments this week, this is an opportunity to get them in. You lose some points for being late, but that's better than 0 points on them. So take that opportunity. On Wednesday, I will be going over the exam 1 study guide. It will not be posted before then. So it'll be posted Wednesday, and then we'll go over it Wednesday, and then next Monday is the first exam. But we will talk about that more on Wednesday. I'm not going to talk about it more right now. And because it'll be available for a couple days for those who do it online, all of that. So as I was saying, we'll talk about that Wednesday. It's not something that I'm going to go over right now. Why is my video not showing? All right, there we go. I do not know why my video shut off, but now it should be back. It was on for a minute. Then it was off. Now it's not. Okay. So as I was saying, Wednesday we'll talk about the exam. Don't worry about it until then. Today we're going to go over evolutionary theory. Actually, I think we were going to start with just that one little bit that we didn't cover last week on objective test horoscopes. And then we will do evolutionary theory, and then we'll start with the biological stuff. The recorded lecture for biological is not there yet. I'll be recording that tomorrow, maybe tonight, but probably tomorrow. If you want to go back and rewatch that. Any questions for me? Anything at all? The pets are great. They just went for a walk with them, so they're doing really good. Okay. Let's do this one real quick. This. Okay. So you should see the thing about horoscopes right now. I just didn't finish this. It's just very brief, really quick. Just going to talk about this real quick. So we were talking about different tests, objective tests, subjective tests, some of the tests where we talked about with like ink blot tests that are hard to score. And then one thing I want to point out is not all objective tests are great. Not all objective tests are good. So when we look at these, we look at things like even horoscopes. So horoscopes is one of those things to bring up that a large percentage of people, maybe not these percentages that you see here anymore, but a large percentage of people read horoscopes and believe horoscopes are so correct and that they are written especially for them. But this actually is what falls under the Barnum Principle, named after Barnum T. Bailey. And basically what it comes down to is horoscopes are written in such a way. If we were doing this in class, it would be actually a lot of fun. I'd pass out horoscopes for everyone. I'd ask everyone their birthday, what their sign is, and hand them out horoscopes. And it's a fun little exercise where you have then people read them, and everybody reads them, and then I would ask, okay, who of you think that this horoscope applies to you directly? And most people would raise their hand, and then I would reveal that all of the horoscopes are exactly the same. Everything that was given to everybody was exactly the same. It wasn't specific for a month or a sign or anything like that. And that is because horoscopes fall under a thing where they basically talk in such general traits that almost anyone who reads them thinks they apply to them. It's basically traits that are so general that they apply to almost everyone. Plus, people have what is referred to as confirmation bias, where you confirm the things you're looking for. And when horoscopes are actually analyzed, what actually comes out with, what they find is that horoscopes get more things wrong than they get right, but people ignore the things that don't apply to them and focus on the things that do apply to them. And again, the things that are right are so general that they end up applying to most people. And this is where it falls into just, it's one of those that are the way our mind works. It's easily tricked, and horoscopes is one of those ways that our mind becomes easily tricked. Interestingly enough, there's been challenges to show that like any psychic or any horoscope reader, anything like that, if they can actually prove that they're psychic or prove that the predictions they're making are correct, that they would get paid $1 million. Randy, big skeptic, his name is just, I'm mixing up his name with Randy Nessie, and his name is not, it's James Randy. James Randy, big skeptic. He offered a bounty of $1 million for anybody proved that they had psychic powers or anything like that, and no one could do it. Everyone failed at it that did try. So it's just one of those that people fall into. I just wanted to talk about that with the horoscopes there, that it's an objective test that really doesn't work because, or you could say it does work, but it doesn't work for what it's intended. What it does do is it preys on basically the way people's minds work and tricks them into thinking that it's real when it's not. All right. Going back now, I want to start with the evolutionary theory. Open up chat again. Okay, so now we're going to start with evolutionary theory. If anybody has any questions or comments, go ahead and pop them in at any time. This is actually a relatively short lecture for my normal evolutionary theory. So I've shortened it down to 15 slides. When I teach developmental, I talk much more about this because it's much more relevant. It's relevant to both, but it's when we talk about development, we have to look at evolutionary theory in detail. I've also in the past taught a evolutionary psychology class where I go into it much more. When I'm talking about human sexuality, when I cover human evolutionary theory at the beginning of human sexuality, it's basically like 60 slides rather than the 15 slides we're covering. But I do want to give a basic overview of evolutionary theory since we've talked about the other ones, especially before we get to biological theory, which basically leans on this heavily. So what we're going to look at is we're going to first define evolution. Then I'll give a bit of background into Darwin. We'll talk about evolution by natural selection. We'll look at a few misunderstandings in evolutionary theory, and we'll finish with a special topic in evolutionary theory, which is sexual selection. Later on in the semester, we'll cover another special topic that I would normally cover here, which is life history theory. but I'm not going to cover that today, but that falls under evolutionary theory as well. It's just something that's better covered later in the semester when we're talking about development specifically. Okay, so first we have to ask the question, what is evolution? And I can open that to you guys if you want to pipe up what you think evolution is. And I'm not talking about evolution in living things right now. I'm just talking about what is evolution. Anybody have anything? What is evolution? Okay, so you got too specific there. You both of you are getting that in chat. It's being said the process of change over time in a species and the changing of traits over time to increase something. I want to be more general than that. General is just evolution refers to change over time. So change over time is part of it, but when you include in species and things like that, now you're talking about living things. When we talk about evolution in general, it's just change over time. You can have evolution in non-living things. We have evolution in cell phone technology. The cell phones aren't alive, but cell phone technology is changing over time. We have evolution in many different domains. So evolution specifically, or not specifically, but evolution in general just refers to change over time. However, now we're going to include it in living things. It's now going to be change over time in the structures of living things. So now we're not just talking about in a species, we're talking about in structure. And in chat, it was said odds of survival. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But really, when we're talking about evolution in living things, we're just talking about the change over time in living things, in the structures of living things, when we're talking about evolution of living things. And when we talk about evolution in general, we're not talking about good or bad. We're just talking about change. So when you say increasing odds of survival, that isn't really referring to evolution in general, because evolution in general is just referring to change. We will talk about in a minute evolution by natural selection, those types of things that are talking about things that increase survival and reproduction. But in general, we're talking about, in general with evolution of living things, we're just talking about this change in structures of living things. It's very important when we talk about evolution to mention that Darwin didn't come up with evolution. We've got writings from philosophers and different writers going back thousands of years that mention evolution. Aristotle mentioned evolution. Not directly by that, but talking about change in living things. So evolution wasn't a new concept when it came to Darwin. Darwin instead, and we'll talk about it in just a minute, Darwin instead talked about what is causing evolution or what is driving evolution. So long before Darwin, evolution was known to exist. Geologists, embryologists, all of these, the various different scientists, even philosophers going back, understood that evolution existed. One of the most popular theories before Darwin was Lamarckian evolution. So Lamarckian theory basically stated that traits that were inherited or traits that were acquired were then inherited. They were passed on. Basically, it said that if a characteristic that's inherited in an individual's lifetime, it is then likely to be passed on. There's a big problem with that theory, though, and that is that most acquired characteristics generally aren't passed on. I put giraffes here because one of the popular explanations in Lamarckian evolution is that giraffes got a long neck because in one giraffe, it had a shorter neck, and it stretched it really long, and it acquired a longer neck because it kept stretching it. Or some of them even say it was reaching down to drink some water and it got its head grabbed by an alligator, and an alligator pulled its neck longer, and its longer neck was then passed on. Well, that's not actually how it works. Most acquired characteristics aren't passed on. Later on, when we talk about epigenetics, and when we look at developmental and look at epigenetics, we will look at how some acquired characteristics can be passed on, but in general, acquired characteristics are not passed on. So Lamarck was basically wrong in his mechanism to explain evolution. So along came Darwin. He liked Lamarck's theory, but thought it was incomplete in scope. Darwin wanted to explain the mechanism of evolutionary change, what was actually going on. He wanted to explain the existence of purposeful structures. How did things like the eye come about? Or other purposeful structures, gills in fish? How did all of these come about? So what is the existence of purposeful structures? And finally, he was interested in the origin of species. I want to be very clear here. This is a common misunderstanding of evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory does not explain the origin of life. It explains the origin of species. The origin of life is actually better explained in physics than it is explained with evolutionary theory. However, Darwin was interested in the origin of different species, how they came about. And so a little bit about Darwin. There's a very interesting video, a Nova special out there you can watch on PBS. You can get it on YouTube. I really recommend it. It's about 2 hours long, but it's basically about Darwin, about Darwin's life. And it's, I believe, titled What Darwin Got Wrong or something like that. And it comes down to the fact that Darwin was way ahead of his time. And a lot of the things we know now, actually Darwin got right. What did he get wrong was mainly along the lines of he didn't even know what genetics was, and he came up with the scope. So Darwin, he was this third generation physician. He wasn't a physician himself, but his father was a physician and his grandfather were physicians. They also raised horses and bred horses. So they had a horse farm, they bred horses. Darwin was going to follow in his father and grandfather's footsteps and become a physician. However, the first time he was in the operating theater, and you got to remember at this time, there was no anesthesia like we have in modern. When they did surgery, they basically cut up on a person who was awake and could see what was going on, and Darwin just couldn't take it. The first time he went in the operating theater in school, it terrified him, and he ran out, and he never wanted to go into medicine after that. So he went into a couple different things. He started with seminary. So he went to seminary school. His focus was on basically a form of geology and insectology. That was his focus. And what should be really pointed out here is he was definitely upper middle class. He didn't really have to work for anything. He, like many scientists of the time, didn't have to get a job to work for a living. He could then become a scientist, which really didn't pay that well. Related to all of this is at the time when ship captains that were basically spending month-long voyages, they were commissioned to do things like do shipments, but also there was commissioned voyages to map out coastlines, things like that. These ship captains, though, there was definitely a class structure that was present at the time. So ship captains weren't allowed to engage socially with their crew. So what ship captains that knew they were going on long voyages would do is they would hire on basically a scientist from the upper middle class, or even the upper class. They would hire on a scientist that was more online with their social standing. And this scientist that they hired on would basically be their social companion for the voyage. Since they weren't allowed to be social with the crew, they would hire on someone to be social with them. In addition, they would have this scientist to do extra things along the voyage. So this ship called the Beagle, it was tasked with plotting out the coastline of South America. And Darwin was hired to be the ship's basically social companion and be a scientist to help out with the mapping of the coastline, places where they landed. Darwin would go in and collect fossils and basically do different things science-wise. So this is a trip that took months and months. Why am I talking about all of this? And as you can tell, I like talking about evolution and I like talking about Darwin. But the TLDR, the reason I'm talking about all this is because off the northwestern coast of South America is the Galapagos Islands. And this is really what drove Darwin going to the Galapagos, was really one of the major things that drove him coming up with his theory of evolution. And these different islands, they're far enough apart that the species didn't intermix between the different islands. However, they were close in appearance, sometimes different in appearance, but they were close genetically. They were close, and Darwin didn't know what genetics were, but they were interrelated species that had differences. Each island had its own tortoises. However, the tortoise shells were different on each island. Each island had birds that were pretty similar, but actually had some pretty big differences. These are specifically the finches. There were finches. And Darwin collected samples of the finches from the different islands, and he brought them back to England. And he went to a person who specialized in birds and said, what's going on with these? And the person who specialized in birds said, these are all different types of finches. And basically they had one recent ancestor, but they had all these different variations like you see here on the right. And each island had different finches. So one island would have the finches with the big beak and big head like you see here. Another island would have a small head and small pointed beak. And Darwin went back and looked at his notes and found out that the finches that had these big beaks like this were on islands that had like nuts or hard seed pods. So their beaks were actually really good at opening up these seed pods. Whereas the finches that had the pointed beaks, they were on islands that had flowers that were basically longer. So these finches could use their beaks to peck into these flowers and into areas. So they didn't have to break anything open. So Darwin from this came to the conclusion that, well, there's these big variation between these different ones, but each one was really suited to their environment. He also took the knowledge he had from horse breeding, because like I said, his family had long been breeding horses, and horse breeders, farmers had known for thousands of years that you can get specific characteristics as output of breeding by putting in specific characteristics. If the mother and the father have specific characteristics, the foal is likely to have those same characteristics. So because he came from a farm that did horse breeding, he had this knowledge that traits were passed on. Also, one of the big keys he had come up was he wrote a paper by Malthus, who basically said that more organisms are produced than can survive and reproduce themselves, leading to what Malthus listed as a struggle for existence. This is where you get the modern things, survival of the fittest, that type of thing came from this. And Darwin actually did some calculations. And if one female elephant began reproducing at the age of 30, had one calf every year for 10 years, 6 calves in total, after 500 years would have 15 million descendants. And if every elephant did that, then the world would be overrun by elephants. And if we looked at that with just about any species, if all species that are produced survived and reproduced themselves, then the world would be overrun by that species. So he boiling these 3 things down, this variation, heredity, and basically a more are produced than can survive, he came up with evolution by natural selection. And evolution by natural selection can be explained with these three things. First, variability exists. So there is variance. There is difference between different individuals. You saw with those finches, they had different sized beaks. So you have variability. This variability can be passed on. Certain variability, and not necessarily the acquired stuff, the stuff that they're born with, certain variability is passed on, and this is heredity. And this is the second major component of evolution by natural selection. And this third and sometimes most important is some variants aid in survival and reproduction better than others. And this is what's referred to as selection. So you have variability. You have variability that's passed on. Some of this variability aids in survival and reproduction. Some hinders survival and reproduction. But when all three of these conditions are met, then some variants will increase in frequency. Those that aid in survival and reproduction will increase. Those that hinder survival and reproduction will decrease in frequency. Let's say you've got a finch with a giant beak that's for cracking open seed pods, but you release it in an environment that there's no seed pods, there's just things that it needs a longer beak to get to. Well, that finch is unlikely to survive. So that variant will decrease in frequency. And if you look at it in terms of the variability being passed on through heredity, then any finches with larger beaks, that'll become less common because those are less likely to survive in that environment than finches with the longer beaks. The same is true in the opposite direction. If there's an environment that has lots of seeds that need to be cracked, well, the finches with the bigger, stronger beaks are more likely to survive. Therefore, they are more likely to pass on the bigger beaks. So this change in frequency of particular variants, whether it's an increase or decrease in frequency, the change in frequency due to inheritance and selection is what's referred to as evolution by natural selection. Darwin wasn't the only one to come up with this. Another guy came up with it at the same time. Why is his name slipping my mind right now? It starts with an M. Either way, another scientist came up with it at the same time. The reason we know Darwin is because Darwin had more evidence for his, and subsequent theories that we're going to talk about and subsequent things that came up after this. Basically, Darwin was right about, whereas the other guy was wrong about. Why am I should know this, and it's just slipping my mind. I said before, I'm pretty tired today, so certain things that should be right there in my mind just are not in my mind. Okay. It's unimportant. It's unimportant. The important thing to note is that Darwin wasn't the only one to come up with evolution by natural selection. It was proposed to the Royal Society in England at the exact same time by two different people. There was a co-thing that they were doing. The other guy, though, he had just come up with it. Darwin actually spent more than 20 years after the voyage on the Beagle before he published his On the Origin of Species. So it wasn't something he came up with overnight. He spent decades thinking about this, refining this, trying to come up with counters to it, trying to come up with what things that supported it. All right, so that's evolution. Let's look at real quick some common misunderstandings about evolutionary theory. One of the most common ones is that human behavior is genetically determined and the environment is unimportant. That is not true. Evolutionary theory is an interactionist framework. That is basically that even if we have genetic-based adaptations, they must be triggered by appropriate environmental input. I got here calluses. Calluses is a evolutionary adaptation, our ability to form calluses. But we don't form calluses without the environmental pressures to form them. If you don't have anything, if you don't work with your hands, if you don't have anything rubbing up against your hands, then you're not going to form calluses. Those who do form calluses are the ones who are working with their hands, and it builds up over time. Over here on the right, I got skin tone. Skin tone is something that changes based on environmental inputs. Some people have more variation, some people have less, but it's something that if you spend more time out in the sun, your skin will become darker. Anybody with any skin tone, the more time you spend out in the sun, your skin tone will change, some more than others, like I said. Next common misunderstanding is if it's evolutionary, we can't change it. And this is a huge one. People think just because something's evolutionary that we can't change it. That's actually what's referred to as the naturalistic fallacy. Just because something's in nature and natural means it's right. So it's not just that. It's not just naturalistic fallacy isn't just if it's evolutionary, we can't change it. Naturalistic fallacy is if it's natural, if it's in the environment, then it's morally right. Both of those fall under the naturalistic fallacy. So basically, because genes and environment interact, we can alter the environment if we want to alter the outcome, like you see here on the left with a hand without calluses. If you don't want calluses, then you don't work with your hands or use gloves. That'll result in no calluses. If you want calluses, work with your hands. It just because it's evolutionary doesn't mean we can't change it. We can change it however we want. Or you see over here on the right with skin tone. She's got very pale skin tone. Either she hasn't been out in the sun or she uses a lot of sunscreen when she is out in the sun. If you want a darker skin tone, you go out in the sun more. If you want a lighter skin tone, you don't go out. Obviously, there's limits. There's genetic limits. But that being said, it is something we can change. And there's even more when it comes to a lot of things that we look at, like, let's say when we start to talk about morality, and we look at the evolutionary theory that drives certain behaviors that are moral or immoral, we still need to understand that even if it's evolutionary, even if there's evolutionary drives, we can overcome this through understanding how the environment and these evolved mechanisms work together. So the thing that I'm always going to talk about when it comes to evolutionary theory is the better we understand evolution and the better we understand our evolved psychological mechanisms and how they interact with the environment, the greater power we have to control or create desirable outcomes. There's Randolph Nesse. He used to be a psychiatrist at U of M. He's now in, I think, Arizona. He started a big program there, but he's a famous evolutionary psychiatrist. He looks at things like how certain psychological conditions, one of the main ones he looked at was depression, and how those are actually adaptive in certain circumstances. Why did we evolve the ability to become depressed? Well, in certain circumstances, being mildly depressed is actually an evolutionary advantage. So, but being majorly depressed is rarely an evolutionary advantage, if at all. So being able to better understand that psychological mechanism and how it interacts with the environment, we can then create better outcomes, more desirable outcomes, and we can do things like reduce depression, or as Nesse calls it, low mood. All right. Next one, and this is one I'm going to talk about for a few slides, and that is that current mechanisms are optimally designed. That is a misunderstanding. That is not true. Our current mechanisms are not optimally designed. Current mechanisms represent adaptations to past environments. This is an important thing. And so the first major thing when it comes to optimally designed, we're going to have three. The first one, A, is that what's referred to as environmental mismatch. Environmental mismatch is when our environment has significantly changed or substantially changed from when these behaviors or mechanisms evolved. So if our current environment differs substantially from our previous one, the mechanisms might not be adaptive or useful anymore. So you've got the original environment when during a period of time where the trait is advantageous. However, then the environment changes. Now the trait is mismatched, so it isn't as advantageous anymore. One of the most common that can be talked about is sugar. We have an evolved desire to eat sugar. We have this strong evolved desire to eat, to carb load, to eat as much carbs as we can, to eat as much sugars as we can. That is because when these behaviors evolved, sugars were rare in the environment, or were relatively rare in the environment. Would have been hard to get to. There would have only been certain times of year we could have gotten them. So it would have been an advantage to eat as much as you could when you could, because then you might gain a little bit of fat, but then during lean times, you lose that fat. So it was a great advantage. So these behaviors evolved in a time when sugars were rare. However, today you can go to the corner store, you can go to the gas station, you can go just down the street. Some of you can turn around and there's tons of carbs, tons of sugars. So we have this desire to eat all the sugars we can that we have to fight because we've got an environmental mismatch. We're in an environment where the behavior that evolved to want to eat all of these because they're rare, they're no longer rare. So we have to fight this desired thing. And this goes back to what I said, just because it's evolutionary doesn't mean we can't change it. We have this desire to eat all the carbs. We can change that though by not eating all the carbs, by mentally stopping us from doing it. Sometimes it's harder than others. Sometimes it becomes more difficult than other times, but we can, through various different ways, we can basically make sure that we don't have it around us, things like that. The other one on the right here, you see aggression. Aggression is something that's a really big environmental mismatch. Throughout most of human evolutionary history, being physically aggressive wouldn't have been as detrimental as it is today. Might have been detrimental, but it wasn't against the law like it is today. So we're in a common environment now where being aggressive is not accepted like it was in the past. So we have that environmental mismatch for aggression. Okay, current mechanisms are not optimally designed. We'll look at B, if I can get it to work. There we go. That is, for B, all adaptations have cost, so not all features can be optimized. I asked the question, why don't we all have a darker skin color? There's a great advantage to having a darker skin color. Having the darker our skin color, the better for protecting us from the sun. The sun can cause skin cancer. So the darker our skin is, the less likely we are to get skin cancer. So having a darker skin tone is a big evolutionary advantage. But why don't we all have a darker skin color? Well, it goes back to this, that all adaptations have costs as well as advantages. So having a darker skin tone, as you see here on the left, is a big advantage to protecting from the sun. However, it comes at the cost of reducing vitamin D absorption from the sun. The darker your skin tone, the less vitamin D you get from the sun. So if you're in an environment where there is less sun, such as Northern Europe, if you're in that environment where there's less sun, then having a darker skin tone is actually a cost, not an advantage, because you are not getting enough vitamin D. Not to mention there's less sun, so you don't need the protection as much. So in environments where there's less sun, it is an advantage to have a lighter skin tone because you can absorb more vitamin D, and there isn't as much of an advantage to having the darker skin tone because you don't need the protection from the sun. Whereas in environments closer to the equator, in environments where there is more sun, then having a darker skin tone is a great advantage because it protects you from the sun, and there's enough sun that you're still getting the vitamin D from that absorption of the sun. So why don't we all have darker skin color? Because adaptations have costs and advantages. So not all features can be optimized. However, this leads us back to the previous one we were talking about, and that is environmental mismatch. We are in a big environment now where people move. Throughout most of our evolutionary history, people really didn't travel that much. And if they did travel, it wasn't that far. Now we've got people who can hop on a plane and go from an environment that's lots of sun to an environment where there's no sun. Not to mention, we've got most people who are inside most of the time. So even people with the darker skin that protect them from the sun, they're inside most of the time. So now they're getting vitamin D deficiencies because they're not getting as much sun. So we've got an environmental mismatch on top of these costs and advantages. So it kind of combines the two. If you're interested in more of this, Nina Jablonski has a fantastic book, Living Color, that talks about the biological and social meaning of skin color and talks about evolution of skin color and evolution of skin tone and all of that. So I recommend that. She's a fantastic writer, fantastic scientist, anthropologist who has spent her life studying things like skin tone and skin color and the advantages and disadvantages therein. Interestingly enough, I talked about how some people are more get more sun, some people get less sun. Those that get less sun evolve to have darker skin tone. Those that get less sun have evolved to get lighter skin tone. There is one exception to that. Does anybody know what that exception is? It's specifically those who get less sun, but actually have a slightly darker skin tone. They do not have the lighter skin tone of those in Northern Europe.
Is it those Russians, I think?
Yes. If you're talking specifically about those in Siberian region of Russia, as well as the northern regions of North America, the Inuits, there's more than just the Inuits, but the Inuits, as well as those in the northern regions of Siberia.
Those people who are typically in higher snow regions is what I was trying to reference.
But it's not snow. That's actually not the reason why they've got darker skin. They didn't evolve lighter skin tone. Does anybody know why? There's a specific reason why they go ahead.
To retain heat better in those colder environments.
That is not it either.
Shoot. All right. Well, that was my
good guesses. Those are good guesses. The snow one is the most common guess, but considering when it's snowy, they're usually covered with most of their body. The skin tone isn't going to affect that. There's a specific reason. And I go back to when I talked about those with darker skin color, or we'll go back to those with lighter skin color. Why did they evolve lighter skin color in the northern regions of Europe? Yes. You're actually on the right track when you talked about vitamin D, but it's not due to the clothing and it's not due to the elevation, but it is due 100% to vitamin D. It's because they don't get their vitamin D from the sun. They get their vitamin D from something they hunt.
The livers.
It's actually the livers and the blubber, because those in the northern regions of Siberia and North America hunt whales, and they get their vitamin D from whale fat. So they don't need to have lighter skin to absorb the vitamin D. They get their vitamin D from a different source. So just really one of those really interesting things where you get this, the different mechanisms and how they can evolve and why they evolve certain ways, and different people in different environments will have different, basically, advantages and disadvantages to different traits. Okay. The last one is recurrent mechanisms are optimally designed as a misunderstanding is that natural selection doesn't have foresight. So it doesn't often find the best solution to a problem. It finds the best solution available to it, to a problem. and that's a best solution to a current problem. What do I mean by that? I mean, it might be that the best solution is X, but X never comes up as a variation. X never comes up as a possibility. That means X isn't what evolves. Y evolves because Y is the best of Y and Z of possible alternatives. Let me give some examples of that. The first is the human eye. So one thing we know from biology is that eyeballs, vision and eyes specifically, have evolved at least 8 different distinct times throughout evolutionary history in living things on Earth. At least 8 different times that we know of. The mammalian eye is one of those evolutions, and the mammalian eye, it actually goes back to amphibians have the same, mammals have the same, all the way back to fish. But the mammalian eye has an optic nerve that goes into the back of the eye. What this does, where the optic nerve goes into the eye, is it creates a blind spot. So in a sense, the eye, the human eye, and all mammals and basically all vertebrates, this is the vertebrate eye, all vertebrates that share this optic nerve that comes into the back of the eye. All vertebrates have a blind spot. For some species, it's more than others. But the point is that there is a blind spot. It is not a perfect system because there is a blind spot. In mollusks, which had a different evolution of the eye, certain squids and octopi, the retina is in front of the optic nerve and they have no blind spot. They have better vision, they can see better. And again, you see this with different insects that evolved eyes in different ways. They've got different advantages and disadvantages, and none of them are perfect. They are all better than others in certain ways, but none of them are exactly perfect. That is because evolution only works with the best it has at the time. It doesn't have foresight to see into the future. When the optic nerve evolved early on, it would have been just a sensory bump that was there, and then eventually it evolved to be bigger, eventually the eye, but now it's got the nerve coming in the back when it had it coming in like this before. The point is that it just worked with what was available at the time. Another example of this is this is the perfect example of mechanisms not optimally designed because it only worked with what was available, and that is what's called the recurrent laryngeal nerve. So the recurrent laryngeal nerve, it basically supplies the motor box in the throat, sensation, basically function and sensation to the larynx, to the voice box. The voice box that's in the throat, it's a nerve that goes from the basically the spine to the throat. Now, optimally, it would be a very short from the spine to the throat, just very short. However, the recurrent laryngeal nerve loops through into the thorax under the arch of the aorta before going to the trachea and the esophagus. So instead of going from this point to this point in a very short line, there is a nerve that goes there, but it isn't the recurrent laryngeal nerve. Instead of going very short, it instead goes all the way down into the chest cavity and comes all the way back up. So it's something that could be very short, but it's very long. Why is this the case? That is because fish, and I'll see, I'm very bad at drawing, but we'll draw fish with an eyeball here. I am a very bad artist, as you can tell. The brain here in a fish, the aortic arch is right here. So when that nerve, it goes straight between the back of the brain and the throat. So it is straight there. However, as mammals evolved and anything evolved out of fish, and things evolved to be land, the chest cavity sunk down in, The shoulders went up, the chest cavity went down in. That means the heart sunk down in. It's not basically directly between the brain and the throat. It is now down in the chest cavity, meaning now the aortic arch sunk down into the chest cavity, and the nerve that initially went around the aortic arch in a straight line now goes all the way down in the chest cavity around this. One of the biggest examples of this is giraffes. Giraffes have a really long one. When we look at some dinosaurs like Brontosaurus, it was super long. But so even in humans, it's relatively long, but giraffes, it is very, very long. You're talking like 12 to 15 foot for this thing that could be done in less than 6 inches. So the example I always like to give, it's like driving from Detroit to Ann Arbor, but going through Toledo to get there. Instead of going straight down 14 from Detroit to Ann Arbor, going down 75 and then back up 23, going from, instead of just direct. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about when I talk about evolution. So one of the things, and it's Wallace was the other name. I was going with M. Wallace is the other one who came up with evolution with Darwin at the same time. So one of the things that actually gave Darwin a lot of headache. So Darwin, like I said, he had spent like 20 plus years coming up with evolution by natural selection. He'd looked at all the different things and all kinds of different evidence, and he read lots of different things that were out there, lots of different scientific papers to help basically come up with evolution by natural selection and publishing on the origin of species. And one of the things that actually kept him up at night was the peacock's feather. He actually wrote about this, that the peacock's feathers, the peacock's tail actually kept him up at night, because he understood that if you had something that disproved evolution by natural selection, if you had any one major thing that disproved evolution by natural selection, it would disprove his theory as a whole. You'd have to adjust his theory, but it would disprove his theory as a whole. And the peacock tail basically disproved evolution by natural selection. Evolution by natural selection, again, if you'll recall, talked about how variations that increase survival and reproduction are more likely to be passed on. How does a peacock's tail aid in survival? And the answer is it doesn't. It actually hinders survival. It's more susceptible to parasites. It's more likely to be grabbed by predators. So to Darwin, the peacock's tail really just, it literally kept him up at night. He had trouble sleeping thinking about it because it was such a counter to his theory. And here's another thing I didn't talk about before, but this is a question I like to put on the exam. So here's something, if you're going to pay attention to one thing, pay attention to this. I love to put this on the exam. So I talked about survival and reproduction. I talked about both. Which is actually more important, survival or reproduction, when it comes to evolution by natural selection? You've only got 2 guesses, survival or reproduction. Which is more important?
Reproduction.
Reproduction is the answer. Most people say survival, but it is actually reproduction. Survival matters. It's still important. It's not unimportant. But survival only matters to get the organism to the point where it reproduces. Evolution does not, the example I like to give is, if you have one individual that lives for 1,000,000 years but never reproduces, evolution is not occurring there. It doesn't matter if he lives 1,000,000 years. If he's not reproducing, he's not passing on his genes. If you got another organism that lasts 10 seconds but reproduces and creates 1,000,000 offspring, well, that individual is having large amounts of evolution occurring because they're passing on their genes. So of the two, if I ask this on an exam, what's more important, evolution or reproduction? It would be reproduction. Not evolution or reproduction, survival or reproduction. It's reproduction. Survival is still important, but reproduction is more important. Well, This is where Darwin it was many years before he came up with sexual selection. And this is the one thing that differentiated him from Wallace. Wallace didn't believe in sexual selection. Darwin did. We've got enough evidence now that sexual selection is true that Darwin was the one that was correct here. But sexual selection defined by Darwin was the advantage in which individuals have over others of the same sex and species in exclusive relation to reproduction. This takes the peacock's tail, which is something that hinders survival, and explains it in the context of it aids in reproduction. If you have something that aids in reproduction, even if it harms survival, not harming survival to the point where you don't get to the point of reproduction, but something that aids in reproduction, even if it harms in survival, like the peacock's tail does, then it is something that will be passed on, and there will be evolutionary pressures to pass it on because it is aiding in reproduction. How does the peacock's tail aid in reproduction? Well, in this case, it's telling a female peahen. If you didn't know, the female of a peacock is a peahen. It's telling the peahen that even though this peacock has a tail that is susceptible to parasites and makes it more susceptible to predation, even though that it survived to this point. It doesn't have parasites in its tail, or it would be faded and wouldn't have the eyes. It survived being able to be hunted by predators. So because it's strong enough, healthy enough to survive potential parasites and predation, that is a strong specimen, and it tells the peahens that it's a good male to mate with. And all species have this to one extent or another. Sexually dimorphic species, the more sexually dimorphic a species is, the more sexual selection is acting on them, but even humans have sexual selection occurring. It's important to note, though, that the same three requirements, that is variance, heredity, and selection, are still present. It's just that the difference is in sexual selection, variants that increase reproduction are selected rather than variants that increase in survival, even at the cost of survival. Like I said, I'd have 45, 50, sometimes even more slides if we were talking more about evolution. I just wanted to cover the basics of it. As you can tell, I can be really long-winded about evolution. I love talking about evolution. One of my favorite classes to teach is evolutionary psychology, just because there's a lot going on here. But I've given you guys now an overview of it. We looked at evolution in general. We looked at Darwin, talked some about Darwin. I really recommend that Nova Special. It's actually called What Darwin Never Knew. That's the one. And one of the main things that I didn't cover here is the fact that Darwin came up with all of this before genetics was discovered. Mendelian genetics was discovered, and I can't say it's before because Darwin didn't know about Mendelian genetics, even though Mendel was around the same time. Actually, Mendel's paper on genetics was on Darwin's desk when Darwin died, but it's believed that Darwin either didn't read it or he didn't understand it, because when Darwin read a scientific paper that he understood, he would cut it to basically denote that he'd read it already. And Mendel's paper wasn't cut, meaning he either didn't understand it or he hadn't gotten to reading it yet. But genetics is something we'll talk about in the biology chapter, and that's something that actually proved Darwin right in many ways and explained that heredity factor that Darwin talked about. Any questions here?
What'd you say that show was you recommend?
What Darwin Never Knew. It's a Nova Special. It's about 2 hours long. It's really good. It basically talks about Darwin's life. When I teach developmental, I show the first 15 minutes of that when I'm talking about the evolutionary stuff.
Thank you, by the way.
No problem. Okay, let's stop sharing this and shift over to the other set of slides. If you've got any questions there, you can still ask. Just want to get this last set of slides opened up. Like I said, for today, let me get chat back opened up because it likes to close anytime I share screen. For today, we're just going to start on this. And one thing, I always throw this disclaimer in, with the biological perspective, it's very term heavy. I dislike lecturing where I'm basically just reading from the slides. But with this biological stuff, it's most of what I'm going to do is read from the slides, unfortunately. It's one of the rare times throughout the semester that I do that. But most of what I do, I'll add in stuff here and there. But most of what I do for this is read from the slides with a little bit of added on. So even though this is 44 slides long, it doesn't take too long. So we will start with this today. Then we will finish with it on Wednesday before we get to the study guide. So we're going to look at, when we're looking at the biological stuff, and for any of you who have taken biology, especially a human anatomy class, I'm sorry about this, but it's got to be covered. So we're going to talk about neuroscience. We're going to look at neurons, neurotransmitters. We'll look at the reflexes, cognitive neuroscience. We'll look at genes, the nervous system, brain, cortex, limbic system, endocrine system. Not all of it today, most of it on Wednesday. First, when we're talking about neuroscience. So neuroscience is a field of psychology now that basically studies the structure and functions of the nervous system, mainly the brain, but also of the peripheral nervous system as well, the network of nerves throughout the body, including the spinal cord. So neuroscience, and it's not just psychology that studies this, there is a growing medical neuroscience field, but there is neuroscience, and psychology is generally referred to as cognitive neuroscience, which is related to cognitive psychology, but cognitive neuroscience is mainly looking at how the brain works and functions. So people that I was colleagues with when I was in grad school that were cognitive neuroscientists that focused explicitly on that. They studied, most of them studied non-human animals like birds and rats, and basically studied the brains in those. Others I've known study monkeys and chimpanzees and their brains, but some still study humans. It's just much more difficult to study humans. But in humans, it's done more through brain imaging. All right, so when we talk about the brain, and we're going to look at it kind of as an overview here. And like I said, there's going to be a bunch of terms. This chapter is just chock full of terms, just term after term after term. First thing we'll look at is glia cells. You don't need to know the specific types, oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells. But the point is glia cells are basically scaffolds that hold neurons in place. We're going to get to what neurons are in just a minute. They hold neurons in place and they insulate neurons to prevent electrical signals from jumping from one neuron to another when they're not supposed to. So again, glia cells, they're more of a protection and structure. And if you take a brain and behavior class, talk more about them. They're Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes, like I said. They basically relate to where in the body the neurons are. You don't need to know that though. Okay. Okay. The next is next thing we're going to talk about is neurons. We're going to talk about this in quite a bit because it's basically what the brain's made of. And it's a brain cell. It has two specialized extension. One extension is for receiving signals. One is for sending signals. Then we're going to have the body, and we're going to have the axon and all of that, which we're going to talk about in the next few slides, then the synapse and the synaptic gap and the neurotransmitters that go into it. There's all kinds of things with the neurons. Let's look at that though. First is the cell body, and that's what we've got here. Within the cell body, there is the nucleus. Some neurons, by the way, the cell body can be off from the side of the axon. It can be off from the side. Some, the cell body goes through the middle of the axon. It all just depends on the neurons. Most neurons is what you see here before I drew on it, with the cell body on one side of the axon and the axon coming off from that. In a sense, the cell body is the large structure that has the nucleus, the brain of the neuron, as well as where it manufactures the chemicals. We're going to talk about things like neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are produced in the cell body. Then they travel down the axon from there. But the cell body is where the neurotransmitters are produced. It's where the energy of the neuron is, basically the fuel for it. It's where the brains of the neuron is. All of that is in the cell body. Then you've got the dendrites. The dendrites typically, almost always, arise from the cell body. There are times where it doesn't, but for the purposes of in here, you don't need to know that. But these are dendrites that come off from the cell body. And the dendrite's purpose is to receive information from either other neurons or from the senses or muscles. So the dendrites, and that there's specific circumstances that it goes beyond all of this, but you don't need to know that. That's something more in-depth for brain and behavior. Did you need me to go back to this slide or?
Yes.
Everything that's on this slide is on the next few slides.
Okay, I'm good. Thank you.
No problem. So, like I said, the dendrites, they receive signals from other things, is the easiest way to say it. The majority of the time, they're going to receive signals from other neurons, but they'll also, like I said, receive signals from the senses. Those are specific dendrites that are sensory dendrites. You don't need to know that, but there's specific dendrites that are sensory dendrites. And then there's specific dendrites that are muscular type dendrites. Those ones receive them in slightly different ways, but typically they're branches like this that are going to then receive signals coming in all of these different places. And then you've got the axon. The axon is a structure that goes from the cell body to the axon terminals. And it is important to note that it goes, the signal and the information and the neurotransmitters are all going to go from the cell body to the terminals. So it's a thread-like structure that extends away from the cell body to other neurons, to organs, to muscles, to basically different things, but it's going to travel down it. Okay. Around the cell body, you have what's referred to as the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath are fatty materials that wrap around and insulate the axon. So we talked about the Schwann cells before. That's what's basically making up the myelin sheath, but it's a fatty material that wraps around and insulates the axon. So it's going to prevent interference from electrical signals generated by adjacent axons. And this is an important one. It speeds up signal transmission. So a axon that has a fully developed myelin sheath is going to have the fastest signal transmission. A axon that has a undeveloped myelin sheath is going to have a slower signal. This is important because, and we'll talk about this later when we're talking about brain development, but human brains continue to develop until a person is almost 26 years old. That's about when brains finish developing in the context of development, in that they're still growing and still things finishing up development. The last thing to develop is the myelin sheath. It still continues to develop. There's a rudimentary myelin sheath, but then it continues to develop. Basically, you've got the axon there. The myelin sheath basically coils around it like this. And early on, you might only have from here to here. So it's still wrapped, but it's not wrapped extra. And it continues to wrap as you grow older. So in the brain, certain neurons, they fire faster and better as we get older. The last region of the brain to develop, and we'll talk about this again later when we talk about development and when we talk about cognitive, but the last region of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is the region of the brain that's responsible for decision-making and risk-taking. So it is one of the reasons to explain why people who are younger take more risks and have poorer decision-making skills, because that part of their brain isn't fully developed yet. But like I said, we'll come back to that later. You see in this drawing, you've got the nodes of Ranvier. I can never say it properly, but these nodes, and basically these nodes allow the electrical signal to pass. Without these, the electrical signal would die off. You don't need to know that unless you take a higher order class like brain and behavior. Okay, off from the end of the axon, you get the axon terminal, and off from the end of that, you get terminal buds. These are places off from the end of the axon that basically they're on the extreme end of the axon's branches, and they store neurotransmitters and they release neurotransmitters when the neuron fires. So like I said, it's going to get information in here. It's going to then travel down the axon, and then it's going to go towards these terminals, the electrical signal is, and when it gets to the end, it's going to release neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are then released into the synaptic gap. The synaptic gap is the gap between, this is the end of, right here, you see the end of a terminal, and right here, you see a dendrite. So out of the gap, these neurotransmitters, which you see in blue here, are released into the gap when the neuron fires, and then it is absorbed into, or not directly into, there's a lot more that goes into it than that, but the easiest way to explain it is that the dendrite here takes on these neurotransmitters, and it causes the dendrite that takes on the neurotransmitters to fire. We'll talk about that in, I believe, the next slide, or yep, we'll talk about that in the next slide, how that happens. So how does that happen? Well, an axon has a charge of negative when it's resting. It has a negative charge. So when you see here, look at this over here, this chart. This is the midpoint. Up here is positive, down here is negative. When it is resting, when a neuron is at its resting state, it is negative, about negative 70 millivolts. It's a really small charge. It might even be even smaller than that, but it's a very negative charge that it has. Then what ends up happening is, as neurotransmitters, we've got that synaptic gap. Neurotransmitters are released into the gap. On the other side, you've got so over here, you've got the terminal. And over here, you've got the dendrite. So what happens is these neurotransmitters, they're released. they bind to the surface of the dendrite. And what this does is it opens up channels. So they're binding and it's opening up channels into the dendrite. These channels that open up allow in sodium. The important thing is that sodium has a positive charge. It's Na. Na has a positive charge. Sodium is normally outside. So in this case, outside has a positive charge. When these channels open up, sodium gets let in. And now the positive charge that's on the outside goes inside. And so normally it's a negative charge. The negative charge turns into a positive charge and it flops the charge. So tiny electrical current is generated when these positive sodium ions rush inside the axon, causing the inside to flip charge. That's what you see in this chart here. You've got a threshold where depolarization occurs. It goes from negative to now positive up here. You now have a positive charge because the sodium is inside. Once that occurs, the electrical signal then travels down the axon. This electrical signal is basically a rapid depolarization that's occurring down this terminal, and behind it, it repolarizes, as in now the sodium is let back out and it repolarizes. It actually, hyperpolarization occurs. It goes below the resting state before it comes back to the resting state here. So the essential of the way the neural firing happens, I see we're out of time. So the way the neural firing happens is it's basically sodium ions rush in, the charge switches from negative to positive, then the electrical signal fires, the sodium ions rush out, it switches back to negative. We'll look at neurotransmitters on Wednesday. Is this the one you needed me to go back to? Okay. Does anybody have any questions? I just realized we're over on time. All right, that's all I have for you today. Like I said, on Wednesday, we'll finish this up. I will go through these slides faster on Wednesday, as well as get through the study guide. And then we will talk more about the exam on Wednesday. You have a great day.
Have a good day, Professor. Thank you for the lesson.
Have a great day.
Thanks.